This is a verse, a podcast about poetry, which really means this is a podcast about life. Words, beauty, nature, love, loathing, longing, loss, rhythm and rhyme, about everything and nothing, and all that falls between. Welcome to a verse. Here in the foothills of western North Carolina, spring has begun. Slowly, surely, the first flowers are blooming, then the trees. It rains, it pours, it gets cold, it gets hot, and spring springs into life. I haven't been in one place in decades, so to watch the same area change from day to day is just pure joy. I have such deep appreciation for my new friends, the daffodils along my driveway, the hyacinths in a neighbor's yard, the huge tulip tree I can see behind the house across the street. For a long time, one of my core daily practices of joy has been walking once or twice a day and looking deeply, really appreciating right where I am. I take pictures, and for the past few years, my Instagram feed each spring is all flowers. Finally, one year, my friend Karen said, "What's with all the flowers?" To me, that's like saying, "What's with all the chocolate?" or "What's with all the nice weather?" Seriously? This is the answer I gave her. It's a quote by Iris Murdoch. People from a planet without flowers would think we must be mad with joy the whole time to have such things about us. For a quarter century, my home base has been New Mexico, where spring means wind and wind and wind and a little green in a lot of brown. Oh, and more wind. So I feel like Iris Murdoch every day among all the lush green and flowers, which means even on days when it rains after 5 straight days of rain, I am grateful for what flower friends I will make friends with and see enjoy tomorrow. And so this weekend, to celebrate the beginning of spring, the spring equinox, the first day of a new season, I've picked some poems about blossoms. The first is one I absolutely love. It's called From Blossoms. It's by Lee Young Lee, a contemporary American poet born in Indonesia to Chinese parents. From blossoms comes this brown paper bag of peaches we bought from the boy at the bend in the road where we turned toward signs painted peaches. From laden boughs, from hands, from sweet fellowship in the bins, comes nectar at the roadside, succulent peaches we devour, dusty skin and all. Comes the familiar dust of summer, dust we eat. Oh, to take what we love inside, to carry within us an orchard, to eat not only the skin but the shade, not only the sugar but the days, to hold the fruit in our hands, adore it, then bite into the round jubilance of a peach. There are days we live as if death were nowhere in the background, from joy to joy to joy, from wing to wing, from blossom to impossible blossom, to sweet, impossible blossom. I began with this poem because we are all so inundated with bad news these days, and it's just so important to remember that we need to find ways to live from joy to joy, from wing to wing, from blossom to impossible blossom to sweet, impossible blossom. Because joy, as I will keep saying over and over again, is not optional. When we feel joy, which is the pure and simple delight in being alive, we feel grateful, we feel present, and inviting that in and escorting all the doomsaying out is what brings the healing we're all so longing for, the healing right now that we all need. But in this poem is also an important message, one that we have forgotten and which I believe this pandemic has come to teach us, that everything is connected, that we cannot forget that everything comes from something, that everything we choose has consequences. And so to choose joy must come with an awareness of our planet, our neighbors, our four-legged, winged, and finned fellow inhabitants. That peach, for example, would not exist without bees. But in our we want it fast world, we are killing off our bees. That peach would not exist without each and everything. The seed, the one who planted the seed, the sun, the sky, the rain, the insects, the pickers, the grocery workers, and we, the enjoyers. We are all in this together. And this brings me to another poem that is about blossoming and so much more. It's by derricote, an African-American contemporary poet. Her poems begin with what John Woodson calls ordinary experiences, dissecting the routine definitions supplied by society as a way to make discoveries about what unsuspected resources the self actually contains. I love what derricote says about joy. She says joy is an act of resistance. So this is a joy-filled, poetic act of resistance called cherry blossoms. I went down to mingle my breath with the breath of the cherry blossoms. There were photographers, mothers arranging their children against gnarled old trees. A couple hugging asks a passerby to snap them like that, so that their love will always be caught between two friendships, ours and the friendship of the cherry trees. Oh, cherry, why can't my poems be as beautiful? A young woman in a fur-trimmed coat sets a card table with linens, candles, a picnic basket, and wine. A father tips a boy's wheelchair back so he can gaze up at a branched heaven. All around us, the blossoms flurry down, whispering, "Be patient. You have an ancient beauty. Be patient. You have an ancient beauty." In this world of public posturing and posing, how often do we all forget that we are all beautiful in the comparison of ourselves to what social media and advertising tells us beauty is supposed to be? I grew up in a family that constantly tried to remake itself for the public, and so I never grew up seeing myself as enough, as beautiful, and that's still what I struggle with when I look in the mirror. But the other day, when I photographed a huge pile of gorgeous fuchsia camellias that had fallen to the ground in the latest rainstorm and lay there on the asphalt among brown leaves and other natural detritus, I did not see ugliness. I still saw all their beauty. I see that all the time in the flowers, and I want to learn to see it in myself and others, to be patient as I learn that we all have an ancient beauty. Which is, of course, the message in this poem by Denise Levertov called The Métier of Blooming. Fully occupied with growing, that's the amaryllis. Growing, especially at night. It would take only a bit more patience than I've got to keep sitting, keeping watch with it till daylight. The naked eye could register every hour's increase in height. Like a child against a barn door, proudly topping each year's achievement, steadily up goes each green stem, smooth, matte, traces of reddish-purple at the base, and almost imperceptible vertical ridges running the length of them. 2 robust stems from each bulb, sometimes with sturdy leaves for company, elegant sweeps of blade with rounded points. Aloft, the gravid buds, shiny with fullness, one morning, and so soon the first flower has opened when you wake. Or you catch it poised in a single brief moment of hesitation. Next day another, shy at first like a foal, even a third, a fourth, carried triumphantly at the summit of those strong columns, and each a Juno, calm in brilliance, a maiden giantess in modest splendor. If humans could be that intensely whole, undistracted, unhurried, swift from sheer unswerving impotence, if we could blossom out of ourselves, giving nothing imperfect, withholding nothing. I love so much how this poem makes us live the growth of the amaryllis as though we were both the observer and the flower itself, and then so gently and subtly and wonderfully leads us to the whole point that if we humans could be that intensely whole, undistracted, unhurried, swift from sheer unswerving impetus, if we could blossom out of ourselves, giving nothing imperfect, withholding nothing, what a beautiful goal for us all, to lead our lives intensely whole, undistracted, unhurried. I began this podcast because I love poetry and I wanted to share something that I love with others, even others who maybe think they hate poetry. But like so many things, we begin from a place of joy. Things can morph into something less joyful, more obligatory, more dutiful. So feeling that, after my first 6 episodes, I took a 2-week break. And after that, I felt refreshed. But then I began thinking about how pushed I felt to get the podcast out by a certain time on a certain day. And the thing was, that day wasn't even the best day to release a podcast. But I did it that day so I wouldn't have it hanging over me over the weekend. Hanging over me. As if this was work and not something I love. Something that brings me joy that I want to share. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And as if the handful of people listening are wondering, where the heck is the podcast today? Oh my God, how did we all get so urgent and hurried? How do we turn things that should be simple joys into obligations? So I gave myself a little talking to and decided to live more like an amaryllis, blossoming and less muscling. And also to remember why any of us do anything at the bottom line. For love, for joy, for connection, for healing. That's why I wanted to do this podcast, and I remember it as I begin to speak these poems, which is why I'm doing this in the first place. Which leads me to my last poem. This poem has been one of my absolute favorites for decades. I actually have the last line of this poem tattooed on my right forearm so I can see it every day. It's called A Blessing, and it's by James Wright. Just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota, twilight bounds softly forth on the grass, and the eyes of those 2 Indian ponies darken with kindness. They have come gladly out of the willows to welcome my friend and me. We step over the barbed wire into the pasture where they have been grazing all day alone. They ripple tensely. They can hardly contain their happiness that we have come. They bow shyly as wet swans. They love each other. There is no loneliness like theirs. At home once more, they begin munching the young tufts of spring in the darkness. I would like to hold the slenderer one in my arms, for she has walked over to me and nuzzled my left hand. She is black and white. Her mane falls wild on her forehead, and the light breeze moves me to caress her long ear that is delicate as the skin over a girl's wrist. Suddenly, I realize that if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom. My friend Karen, the same one who asked about the flowers, asked me yesterday if I was happy. I said that I prefer the word joy because happy is always felt contingent on something, and so we often fall into the trap of trying to recreate the something that made us happy once instead of just being present to the joy all around us. That's what I do on my walks, is I just enjoy the flowers of today instead of looking for the ones from yesterday. And that's what this poem reminds me, that when we allow ourselves to look and be present and share the world with one another, we have these moments of such joy that if we stepped out of our bodies, we would break into blossom. And so on this first day of spring, let us each bring our blossoming selves to the world in joy and in healing and in hope and in connection. Blossom. Thank you for listening to A Verse, a podcast about poetry for the lovers and the loathers, a podcast about life, words, beauty, nature, love, longing, loss, rhythm and rhyme, about everything and nothing and all that falls between. Thank you for listening to A Verse.